Hi guys, welcome back to BioBulletin. Today we're joined with our first ever guest, and we're going to be having a very interesting and detailed scientific discussion situated around depression and the effects it has, as well as elements on treatment and much more.
Hi guys, I'm Charu and today we will be talking about depression. So, what is depression? The best way to describe depression is that it's a downward spiral. It's a state of mind in which a person with depression is at a constant low and they're unable to get out of that constant low. Um, there really isn't a way to sort of diagnose depression. Like, there aren't any MRI scans or tests that you can do to say you've definitely got depression. It's just your symptoms. Like, every person has different symptoms, and you go to the doctor and you say, "These are the symptoms I have," and based on that, you can get diagnosed. So, if I explain it a bit metaphorically, it's a bit like a hurricane. So, why do you get a hurricane? Is because you've got three or four different factors that are at play at the same time. And that's a bit like what depression is. It's not just when one of the causes of depression, which we will talk about later, is at play. It's when three, four, or even five different factors are at play, and that's when you get depression.
So, how are the different areas of the brain affected individually when someone has depression or has symptoms of depression?
So, depression is primarily a result of poor communication between the thinking part of your brain and your emotional part of the brain. So, the thinking part is your prefrontal cortex, and the emotional part is the limbic system. So, the prefrontal cortex is the CEO of the brain. It controls impulses and motivation. So, the prefrontal cortex is divided into four parts. Two parts are concerned with outside world, so that's anything outside your body, so problem solving with the outside world, and two of the parts are concerned with the inside world, so that's inside your body. And these two parts, they think about the emotions we feel. So in a depressed brain, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for worrying, guilt, shame, problems with thinking clearly, indecisiveness, and this can be exhausting to the person who's having these thoughts. Now, the limbic system is located in the middle of your brain, and it's the emotional part of the brain, and it's responsible for things like excitement, fear, anxiety, memory, and desire. So, in a depressed brain, people often have bad focus, they have short attention spans, and
Hmm.
they have a lot of bad memories. So, what I mean by that is when you have a lot of negative thoughts, you tend to build memories in a very negative context. So, if you're spending a lot of your time in a negative state of mind, you're still building memories, but those memories are saved in your brain in the bad context. So, when you're happy and you try to recall happy memories, you find that you don't have a lot of happy memories, and all the bad sort of tragic moments in your life start resurfacing. And I think that's one of the worst things about depression is because that keeps the individual with depression in that low state of mind, and it sort of leads to that person having the same downward spiral. So you can imagine someone with depression having all these problems, and it's honestly quite exhausting.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there are lots of areas of the brain that are impacted with depression. The main ones being the amygdala, hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. There are both structural and functional abnormalities in these areas. So the amygdala is linked with emotional response, and it does this and it's linked to emotional response by facilitating it, and so causes emotional response, which is theorized to cause some of the symptoms of depression, which we can discuss in more detail later. Furthermore, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for emotional decision making, again, which is obviously again linked to many of the symptoms such as low mood and irritability. The hippocampus is located near the center of the brain. It stores memories and regulates the production of a hormone called cortisol. The body releases cortisol during a time of physical and mental stress, including during times of depression. So problems can occur when excessive amounts of cortisol are sent to the brain due to a stressful event or a chemical imbalance in the body. Cortisol is also linked with the aforementioned physical changes to the amygdala, and many say that cortisol causes the amygdala to swell. So, in a depressed brain, The long-term exposure to increased cortisol levels can slow the production of new neurons and cause neurons in the hippocampus to shrink, and this can lead to memory problems. So to go into a little more detail on neurons, they're the cells responsible for receiving sensory input from the external world and for sending motor commands to our muscles and for transforming and relaying the electrical signals at every step in between that process, basically. It's structured into three main parts, which is dendrites, axons, and the soma. Dendrites are branch structures spreading through smaller regions more effectively. The axon is the output structure of the neuron. When a neuron wants to communicate with another neuron, it sends electrical messages called an action potential through the entire axon. And the soma is where the nucleus lies and where the neuron's DNA is housed and where proteins are made to be transported throughout the axon and dendrites. But does anyone know how neurons actually communicate?
So going a little bit more in depth about action potentials. So the exact definition would be neurons communicate with each other via electrical events, which are called action potentials, and chemical neurotransmitters. So at the junction between two neurons, which is commonly known as a synapse, an action potential causes neuron A to release a chemical neurotransmitter. And this neurotransmitter can either help, which is also known as excite, or hinder, which can be known as inhibit, neuron B from firing its own action potential. So in an intact brain, the balance of hundreds of excitatory and inhibitory inputs to a neuron determines whether an action potential will result. So when we talk about depression, it's been linked to a number of problems or imbalances in the brain, specifically with the neurotransmitters serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. It is very difficult to actually measure the level of neurotransmitters in a person's brain and their activity, but what we do know is that antidepressant medications, which are used to treat the symptoms of depression, are known to act upon these particular neurotransmitters and their receptors. So I'm going to be talking about antidepressant medications later on in the treatment section of the podcast, but going over it roughly, the neurotransmitter serotonin is involved in controlling many important bodily functions, including sleep, aggression, eating, and mood. And serotonin is produced by serotonergic neurons. And current research suggests that a decrease in the production of serotonin by these neurons can cause depression in some people. And more specifically, it's a mood state that causes some people to feel suicidal, essentially. And another hypothesis suggested that a deficiency of the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, in certain areas of the brain was responsible for creating a depressed mood. And there's also more recent research which suggests that there's a group of people with depression who have low levels of norepinephrine, which is one of the neurotransmitters that we now believe to actively cause depression. And dopamine is also linked to depression, and this plays an important role in controlling our drive to seek out rewards, as well as our ability to obtain a sense of pleasure. So low dopamine levels explain why people with depression don't get the same sense of pleasure out of the activities they partake in compared to people that have a high level of dopamine. So overall, how is a healthy brain different to a depressed brain, and how does this affect symptoms of depression?
A lot of people tend to forget about the connection between depression and the brain. They usually consider the physical effects like weight change, regular sleep problems, right? Banyan Mental Health said that when scientists compared the depressed brain with a healthy brain, they found grey matter abnormalities, brain shrinkage, and a more active amygdala.
So, what is the grey matter?
So grey matter is the brain tissue made up of cell bodies and nerve cells. People with depression have thicker grey matter in parts of the brain involved in emotions and self-perception. And brain shrinkage is because of large amounts of cortisol being released due to a stressful event or a chemical imbalance in the body. It's a stress hormone in our brain, and so the brain itself shrinks essentially. In particular, it's the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex that are affected. In a healthy brain, neurons are produced, like Kanishka said, through adult life in the hippocampus. But in people with depression, the consistent exposure of cortisol slows the production of new neurons and causes the hippocampus to shrink, which leads to memory problems. The prefrontal cortex suffers in a similar way. I mentioned the amygdala too, and it's another brain structure that regulates emotions. And people with depression have a larger and more active amygdala than in a normal brain. And the amygdala in depressed people is more active than in people without depression when exposed to a negative stimulus like a sad face. It causes irregular sleep patterns and hormone complications. So I think increased cortisol levels plays another part here. So basically, when the section of the brain shrinks, so do the functions associated with that particular section. So if the prefrontal cortex, for example, and the amygdala work together to control emotional responses and the recognition of emotional cues in other people. To be diagnosed with depression, you must display 5 or more of the symptoms, like I said before, at least once a day over the course of 2 weeks. It also triggers persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness, decreased or increased in appetite, accompanied by extreme weight loss or weight gain. Fatigue, that's the most common one. It's way beyond normal tiredness, though. Excessive and inappropriate feelings of guilt or worthlessness, and multiple thoughts of death or suicide. There are a lot of myths surrounding depression which aren't true, and that there's a certain stigma surrounding mental health illness overall, isn't it?
So I think a common myth about depressed people is that they cry a lot, which isn't true, because depression, like I said, is primarily a result of poor communication between the thinking prefrontal cortex and the emotional limbic system, which often results in an emptiness and like a hole-like feeling, which is quite frustrating for people with depression because they don't actually feel, they don't cry a lot, they feel numb, which is it's a feeling that's very hard to explain. And not everyone that cries is someone who's depressed. And another common myth is that depression is hard to treat. I think to treat is the wrong word because depression it's a condition that you must manage. It's not a disease that you can treat. And to manage this condition, you can do several things like take antidepressants, you can do therapy, which is not something that a lot of people do, but it's very helpful, and many different ways, which we will cover later. But the main message is that you must manage this condition because you can bring it back to normal. You can bring a depressed person back to normal, as in you can bring them back to normal ways of functioning, but that doesn't ensure that the depression will not come back again.
Yeah, I think to just go further on a couple of myths, like you said, there are quite a lot. So a lot of people think depression has to be caused by something sad, and everyone experiences sad thoughts or unhappiness at times. But depression can often be like people don't necessarily know the cause. They can just have random periods of depression. It doesn't have to have a root cause in like a specific sad moment. Additionally, it's not like a phase or something that should be treated lightly, like many think it is. It is an illness in its own right, and just because it's not visible on the surface doesn't mean it's not a complex disorder for types. And it has lots of social, psychological, and biological origins, and it can be treated in a variety of ways, which we'll touch on later. The last one is also that antidepressants alone don't necessarily cure depression, as many people think. Often it may require therapy as well as antidepressants, but antidepressants can almost just postpone recovery in some situations with kind of boosts of temporary happiness or even just alleviation of sadness, and acts as like a short fix as opposed to a long-term increase in mood and alleviation of depression.
There's neuroimaging techniques that are used too, right? Like different types.
Yeah, there are loads of neuroimaging techniques that you use. So some of them are fMRI, X-rays, MRI scans, PET scans, SPECT scans, and I will be going through some of them. So let's start with what these techniques can actually measure. So depression is often associated with decreased activity in different parts of the brain and low metabolism and perfusion. Perfusion is the flow of blood to different organs and cells. So it can measure, again, the cell activity. So the different imaging techniques like fMRI, it provides an indirect measure of the neural activity. Another MRI technique, ASL, is used to map blood distribution to different parts of the brain. And then SPECT neuroimaging can predict who will respond to certain antidepressants. And these and SPECT imaging especially is used to see whether or not antidepressants are actually working. So for example, you can use SPECT imaging to see whether people are likely to respond to SSRI antidepressants, which is serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And what these antidepressants do is increase the concentration of serotonin in the synapse. And I think serotonin is like the neurotransmitter that makes a person happy. So
Yeah, promotes their drive to
yeah. So yeah. So you can that's what you can use SPECT neuroimaging to sort of measure. I'll be going through some of the newly developed treatments for depression. So ECT is the most effective antidepressant treatment, apparently, through research. It operates through induction of generalized seizures, but how and why this actually might be beneficial is unknown, because seizures can be dangerous for a depressed person. So based on animal models, it's been speculated that ECT, it promotes neurotransmitter release. And what happens is after the seizure, there's evidence that serotonin and dopamine neurotransmitters are released. However, one of the main limitations of ECT is that the clinical effects are short-lived. So although a person might be fine for a certain amount of time after the ECT, I don't think it's long-term. Another technique is TMS. So trials for TMS have been conducted over 20 years, and they are coming positive. So it's shown a lot of development, and it's shown to be working. And another great thing about it is that it's non-invasive, and it stimulates blood flow in parts of brain using magnetic stimulation. So that's something to keep an eye out for if this is a topic that you're interested in. So just research about TMS more. And another thing, another technique that's being developed is deep brain stimulation. So have a go at that as well.
So I'm going to be talking about the pharmacology side of it. And if you don't know what pharmacology is, it's the study of drugs on living systems. And there are several treatments for depression in terms of antidepressant medication, and there are four main ones. SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, is the main one. And doctors often start by prescribing an SSRI. These medications are safer and generally cause fewer bothersome side effects than other types of antidepressants. And they work by slowing down the reuptake of serotonin neurotransmitter molecules by neurons that are found in the synapse. And serotonin, there's also another type called SNRIs, which are serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. And these affect serotonin as well as norepinephrine and other neurotransmitter systems such as dopamine. And SNRIs work like SRIs in that they inhibit the reuptake of neurotransmitters at the junction between the transmitters. So they both work with the same sort of system, but they just affect different neurotransmitters. And NDRIs work in the same way as the other neurotransmitter reuptake inhibitors, but target norepinephrine and dopamine. And the oldest type of antidepressant is, and which is disused now, is tricyclic antidepressants. And they are usually the typically second or third choice treatments, but they are very rarely seen because of the long list of side effects associated with this family of medication, including weight gain, sedation, visual disturbances, problems focusing, anxiety. And there's a little interest in further research or development of TCAs. So the final drug I'm going to be talking about is monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and which are commonly known as MAOIs, and they're enzymes that break down serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine. And by preventing these enzymes from working, MAOI medications allow neurotransmitters to remain in the synaptic gap longer. There's also a couple of other treatments aside from antidepressants, which we've mentioned, such as TMS and deep brain stimulation. And going a bit deeper into deep brain stimulation, it involves implanting electrodes within certain area of the brain, and these electrodes produce electrical impulses that regulate abnormal impulses, and or the electrical impulses that can affect certain cells and chemicals within the brain. So the amount of stimulation in deep brain DBS is controlled by a pacemaker-like device placed under the skin in your upper chest, and a wire that travels under your skin connects this to the device to the electrodes in your brain.
So, depression treatment has changed hugely over the past 50 to 100 years. So, towards the beginning of the 1800s, new therapies for depression were being developed, and this included water immersion, which obviously involves keeping people underwater for as long as possible without them drowning. It also included special spinning stools, which cause dizziness in order to rearrange the contents of the brain into the correct positions. Benjamin Franklin introduced an early form of electroshock therapy, with horseback riding, special diets, and enemas and vomiting also being recommended as treatment methods. many desperate people were treated with lobotomy, which is the surgical destruction of the frontal portion of the brain. And many treatments at the time were just simply inadequate for severe depression, and that's why lobotomy was used. It had become popular as a treatment because it had a supposedly calming effect, but they were often unsuccessful. Um, they usually cause the person to actually undergo the inability to make decisions and extremely poor judgment, as well as personality changes, and even worse, they sometimes led to a coma or even death. Clearly, treatments developed a lot since then. It's quite difficult because depression and schizophrenia weren't differentiated until the late 1800s, which led to a lot of incorrect diagnoses and ineffective treatment methods. And depression has long been written about, with people thinking it was evil spirits within you and other outrageous beliefs like that. But there always was, and sadly still is, a certain stigma around depression, which is obviously lessened with time. But a lot of people were viewed as weak or masculine for claiming to have mental health issues, and that kind of added to the lack of understanding and lack of research into treatment methods.
Depression is a very key topic of discussion, especially since the recent lockdowns we've been stuck in. More than 264 million cases worldwide have been recorded recently, so education in this topic is very relevant. Altogether, we've dealt with a large amount of detail. Thank you to Charu for joining today's podcast and providing her outlook. If you'd like the video, subscribe. Leave any comments or topics you want us to discuss in the Google Forms below for future podcasts. Follow our Instagram. Thank you, guys.
Follow our Twitter.